I want to do a little bit to help you understand these pieces right here, right? Because look at this. This notion of disorganization, if you're not a psychologist or a therapist, you probably wouldn't necessarily make this connection. But very often, disorganization is consistent with some form of psychosis, right? Well, it's also really common with trauma. And I want you to understand why that is. This notion of being disorganized, this notion of having memories that are suspect. So let's talk a little bit about the hippocampus, because the way memory works is this. Most of us think of memory as something that happened, right? A story about something. And then the older you get, the shorter the story gets, and there's less detail. So what's going on with a memory is this. Every memory is a collection of related data points. And by data points, I mean sights, smells, sounds, sensations. And what happens is the brain, using all the senses, inputs the data. And when the data is inputted, the limbic system is responsible for both putting a label on it and then connecting the related data points. So if I approach you with a stack of files and I say, well, you put them in alphabetical order, and there's no labels on the files, how easy is that? Not easy. So the limbic system has to put the labels on the file. Okay? The hippocampus, part of the limbic system, is the part of the brain that is responsible for putting those labels on the files. It's also responsible for making sure that all the files that go together, all the memories that were connected to X event, get correlated, get connected to that event, so that when you think of Wrigley Field, all your memories about the Cubs come up. Now that sounds like, really? But yeah, can you imagine how wacky it would be if when you thought about Wrigley Field, you only had memories of the Red Sox? I mean, A, how beautiful would that be as a Sox fan? But so this hippocampus plays a role in contextualizing. So one of the labels that gets put on a sound, a sight, a smell, a sensation is a date stamp, essentially, of when did that happen. And the thing about the hippocampus is, during a traumatic event, we now know from actual scientific studies of the hippocampus, not just theoretically, from behavioral studies, we know that the hippocampus phases in a traumatic event. And so what it does is, it goes from what we call flashbulb mode. Now, back in the 70s and 80s, before we had these actual studies of the brain itself, people were saying, well, this theory about the hippocampus going through flashbulb mode, that's not accurate. What's really going on is, the reason why these victims have such good memories of certain parts of the experience is because those are the parts of the experience that they are rehearsing in their head over and over and over again. A reasonable hypothesis, just wrong. The science now says very clearly, no. The hippocampus is actually working overtime to try to encode as much data as possible. And then what happens is, the hippocampus basically runs out of space. It can no longer continue to encode because it's got to do the process of making sure all the files that belong together stay together. That's called consolidation. It has to start consolidating, grouping the data points that have been encoded. So you've got all these files and they've got labels on them, but you then have to group all those files together. And you can't both group and encode if you've got a boatload of files that are already encoded. So what happens is, the hippocampus then goes into what we call fragmented mode, where it's doing a little bit of encoding, but it's mostly consolidating. It's mostly grouping the stuff that's already been encoded. And so that's why you have victims who will say, I remember bam, 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 and then it kind of goes fuzzy. And then I remember smelling, salt, or I have this vague recollection of, well, and one of the dangers is we as non-traumatized humans, we want to put stories in order, beginning, middle, end. And so to be trauma-informed is to understand that instead of saying, what happened next, you say, tell me more about whatever it is they just told you. There's a technique called the forensic experiential trauma interview, which I go around the country training with some law enforcement colleagues, but it works in any context. So the client says to you, and then it kind of gets fuzzy. I mean, I distinctly remember hearing the sound of someone's voice. Now, the temptation, if you're particularly, if you're an attorney or if you're an advocate trying to figure out what happened, you're going to most likely say, well, so when did you hear that, right? Or, well, okay, wait, did that happen before or after? To be trauma-informed is to say, tell me more about that voice that you distinctly remember hearing. You want to use their words. Because what happens is, we don't know what's still getting encoding. Look, it doesn't say no encoding, it says minimal encoding. So we don't know what somebody has remembered. We don't have time to get into it today, but again, if we're doing a full day on this, I really get into a lot of detail. This notion that memories, think of memories as clusters of data points. And some clusters of data points are only connected to a smell or a sound. And so if I'm telling you the story of a Red Sox game, I may not remember a certain part of the game unless I remember the smell of the popcorn that I was eating when that part of the game. Does that make sense? So when you're interviewing somebody and you're gathering your data, to the best of your ability, avoid trying to timeline it. That's what it means to be trauma-informed. You can go back later and try to timeline it. And as an attorney or an advocate, you've got resources that the investigators don't have. Most importantly, their investigation. Right? You're not dealing with somebody who, right, if it's a criminal case and it's to you, they've already done the investigation for the most part. And if they haven't, okay, well, you don't have that resource. But look at how recent this is. I mean, this is 2014, folks. In my world, that's like yesterday in terms of research. This is really new. As we like to say in the psychological field, you all are on the cutting edge. It really is. It's cutting edge. This is cutting edge. This is the kind of stuff you can geek out on, is what I'm saying.